Hello and welcome to the second of our NESHI Fellows Forum. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging country. Today I'm located in the Darawal Nation and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional custodians of this land, the Wadi Wadi people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second of our Fellows Forums. My name is Sarah O'Shea, and I'm the Director of the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, or NESHI for short. NESHI is housed at Curtin University and is funded by the Commonwealth Government with a dedicated mission to improve the higher education outcomes, that is, access, participation, retention, success and completion rates for marginalised and disadvantaged people. We do this through a variety of strategies, including research, practice and policy. One of the programs that we run are the Equity Fellowships, and we currently have 5 fellows that are finalising their research, with the 6th who is just completed. And today I have the pleasure of introducing one of those fellows, Dr. Andrea Simpson, who was awarded a year-long Equity Fellowship to explore pathways to allied health, insights from Indigenous health professionals. As you would be aware, this year has been particularly difficult, and with our fellows, Andrea included, experiencing lockdown at different stages of her research. And today, Andrea is joined by Kim Ali. Kim has worked on the project with Andrea and contributed to the extensive findings from this project. We've taken a slightly different approach to these presentations and asked each of the fellows to prepare a short TED talk that focuses on a specific element of the research. This is followed by a live Q&A session, which today will be facilitated by Professor James Smith, who is a leading expert in this field. And now I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that we can play the video from Andrea, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Kulin Nation. I would like to recognise their ongoing connection to the land and value their unique contribution to Australian society. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be watching today. I myself am a non-Indigenous researcher, and I live and work on the lands of the Kulin Nation. I arrived in Australia, almost 20 years ago. I flew into Townsville from Johannesburg, very excited to take on my first clinical position. At the time, Townsville was short on allied health professionals, hence importing me in, and my introduction to the working world was a flurry of activity. Not long after arriving, I was booked for my first trip to Palm Island. Palm Island is home to the Munbara people, and it's located about 65 kilometres northeast of Townsville. To get there, I boarded a very small chartered plane, maximum 10 seats aside from the pilot. All my fellow travellers looked much like me, young, European, holding various types of professional equipment. I don't know if you've ever been lucky enough to fly very low over parts of northern Queensland. They say powerful images stay in your mind, and for me, I've never forgotten the beauty of that day. I think particularly this year, without the ability to travel easily, I have often thought back to the blue of the ocean and the green islands dotted below us. I tested 10 children that day, all with severe hearing loss due to chronic ear infections, a condition very common in Indigenous communities. On Palm Island, almost 75% of the children will experience chronic ear infections at some or other point. Without effective treatment, schooling and language is inevitably affected. Only 12% of children on Palm Island will go on to complete high school. Although antibiotics are available at the GP clinic on the island, all these children would need specialist care. And that care is only available on 3 visits per year. At the end of the day, my fellow travellers packed up our bags and went home. They had similar experiences to me. We would do what we could on the day, but always flew back out again. And there was no opportunity to build relationships, to build trust, and to build continuity of care. It was this experience which really got me thinking about diversity in healthcare and how this could impact on the quality of healthcare provision, particularly for Indigenous communities. Did you know that only 0.5% of doctors are Indigenous and only 0.4% of allied health professionals? In real terms, that's less than 400 doctors, 50 speech pathologists, 20 dietitians, and 10 optometrists. In 2018, Indigenous enrolments in higher education accounted for approximately 2% of the student population. However, in allied health, Indigenous enrolments accounted for only 1%. So although we have made significant inroads in Indigenous enrolments in higher education over time, for the professions, we are still a long way off from reaching population parity. I was interested in finding out more about the socio-demographic profile of Indigenous learners in allied health professions. I was also curious about what made Indigenous learners choose allied health to study and what their experiences were. These questions were part of a larger project which looked at best practice in the retention and recruitment of Indigenous students into allied health careers. When we compared the socio-demographic profile of Indigenous students with non-Indigenous students in allied health, we found that Indigenous learners differed on several indicators. These indicators made some professions more accessible for Indigenous students than others. For example, the presence of a regional campus and multiple entry points were also correlated with higher numbers of Indigenous students. These findings were supported by qualitative data. We spoke with several Indigenous students and graduates about their experiences, and I'd like to share one of these stories with you today. Kathy is a qualified social worker. She grew up in a small regional community, and her father was part of the stolen generation. Both her parents worked physical labouring jobs to support their family. Kathy completed Year 12 on to enrol at university, but decided to leave after her second semester. She felt far from community and life took her in a different direction. Whilst raising a young family, Kathy ended up taking several short TAFE qualifications. She chose community services as she didn't have a driver's license at the time and it was offered across the road from her. She really enjoyed the experience and it built up her confidence. So when her daughter enrolled in university sometime later, she decided to join her, enrolling in a social work degree. Her second time at university still wasn't smooth sailing. She was surviving on ab study. She had significant caring responsibilities. She was travelling large distances to campus and she had no internet at home. She describes relying heavily on the Indigenous support unit, not only for the practical supports they offered, but also as a space to feel welcome and connected. Kathy's story had several similarities to the other graduates that we spoke with. All chose their career path because they wanted to make a difference. All felt a strong sense of responsibility to their family and wider community. And all felt that the sense of belonging and practical supports offered by the Indigenous support units were invaluable in getting them through their studies. What is also striking is that some health professions offered a second chance. So for Kathy, she was able to use her industry experience as well as her previous TAFE qualifications to get credit for her first year of study. However, her choice of degree was quite limited in that there are only a handful of professions which offer this degree of flexibility. Safety and its presence or absence was another strong theme which emerged from the interviews. Safety was something graduates felt was lacking outside of the Indigenous support unit, particularly when out on clinical placement. Many graduates were the only Aboriginal student in their study program, and once employed, surrounded by predominantly white colleagues. Many participants mentioned that working in a predominantly white profession was exhausting at times and did not feel like a safe space to be. Attracting and retaining students into the professions requires cultural safety practices embedded throughout the student experience and is not just the responsibility of the Indigenous support unit. Graduates mentioned small but important gestures which made them feel seen and heard. These could be an acknowledgement from a lecturer, recognition from a peer, or an image of Aboriginal heritage on campus. I would like to share one final story before closing. Layla, an Aboriginal woman studying audiology, shared with me her dream of setting up a mobile clinic and travelling back to her community in Western Australia once she graduated. It is young people such as Layla who can provide a shared cultural experience so important for quality healthcare provision, not just to service Indigenous communities, but also to educate non-Indigenous professionals in providing culturally competent care. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree with me that that was a terrific presentation that provided a really clear introduction to Andrea's research. And I'd like to thank Andrea for conducting this research. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Andrea and James, who will be facilitating this session, and Kim, who, as I said, has been involved in the research from the beginning. So over to you guys now for the live Q&A. And also don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A box, because James is watching that and is willing to introduce those questions as well.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And thank you to Andrea for that presentation, and welcome to Kim as well. Just a quick note to the participants online today, please feel free to, again, put your questions and answers that you might have in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. And please don't be shy. We're really keen to make sure that this is a nice, healthy, productive discussion. And Andrea, what a great way to start off with, and to be looking at that health education nexus within an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander higher education context, something that's very dear to my heart. To start us off with, can you, both yourself and Kim, maybe tell us a little bit about what actually brought you to this topic in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, thanks for joining, and thanks to Sarah for introducing us. So I, as you heard in the talk, I suppose a bit of a long history for me as an interest in this topic. But specifically, about a year ago, a colleague of mine from VATCHO, or the Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Community Health Organisation, approached me, and I was the course coordinator for audiology at the time in La Trobe University. And she approached me and she said, I've got a couple of workers, they qualified as Indigenous health workers, they'd love to be audiologists. Do you know how they could get into the course? And I went, oh, wow, well, we'd love to have them. And I looked into it and found it really wasn't that easy. They had extensive industry experience, they had certificate 4s, they had a lot of health training and a lot of hours, but the structure of audiology made it very difficult for them to get in without pretty much having to go do an undergraduate degree, you know, support themselves through another 4 or 5 years of study before getting into that path. And that led to conversations with Indigenous Allied Health Australia, IHA. they were really interested as well in it. And so all these things sort of came together. And so when the Equity Fellowship came up, it was sort of just the perfect timing to put some of these ideas into place. And I'll let Kim chat as to how she came along onto the project.
Okay, hi. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. And I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting all around Australia on traditional lands, and acknowledge past elders, past and present, as well as other Indigenous people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I'm actually Aboriginal myself. I'm a Murray from North Queensland. I wasn't born in Townsville, but I grew up in Townsville. I was born out in Western Queensland. And so, but I've been down in Melbourne for a number of years now. I've been politically active for quite a long time in Aboriginal rights and campaigning and things like that. And plus my academic background is actually in settler colonial histories. I'm completing a PhD on that at the moment. But obviously a friend of mine informed me, who knows Andrea, that she was looking for a researcher. So I thought, well, this is a great opportunity for me to be involved in something that was important to me with Indigenous education and involving more Indigenous students and Aboriginal students into areas that are definitely important to the community. So that sort of was the initial segue into working with Andrea. So it's been, while I had you know, a reasonably good idea of the health background and various things in relation to our communities, it's been an interesting project to work on this, to be able to see it much more close up, and to also see it obviously from an education perspective, because I have for a number of years also worked with the various Aboriginal student units here in Melbourne, working with students and tutoring them and things like that. So I might just leave that as my introduction for the moment. Yeah. So thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much, Kim. And it sounds like that you and Andrea have worked quite closely in a very collaborative way, a sort of two-way learning process, which we hear a lot about in the Indigenous education space in particular. There's been a question in our chat function from Phil, and Andrea, it's around the power imbalance as a non-Indigenous researcher working in an Indigenous research space. And clearly you've been working with Kim, but did you want to reflect on what that journey has looked like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question on that. I have to admit, it's something I've really wrestled with this whole year. And a lot of the participants that I've spoke to and a lot of the communities and groups that I've spoke to have spoken with me about this. And I suppose having Kim on board was essential for that reason, in guiding me through that process, but also the Indigenous bodies that I communicated with and that were originally the instigators of the project, and working closely with IHA, I suppose, and making sure that the project was in their interests and driven from their goals and perspectives rather than mine. But what made it tricky this year in COVID was that a lot of those relationships were harder to build because suddenly we were all remote and we were all online. And so, whereas before I'd hoped to travel and, you know, build those relationships up that way, I had to tread a lot differently this year and really take a step back and make sure the research was still driven from what was good for the Indigenous organisations rather than myself as a researcher. And Kim and I have had really good conversations about this as to how we negotiate that. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Kim, or if you think that answers that, James. But
it'd be great to hear from Kim about it as well,
yeah,
from her perspective.
Yeah, no, I think it is, obviously this is a very important question, and given, you know, the power imbalances that are often in existence. So we have, as Andrea said, we have talked about this quite a lot, about how do we even, Andrea was quite worried about even doing the TED style talk. How does she present it in a way that doesn't come across as, for want of a better word, a colonizing way. So we've discussed that out quite a lot, about how is it that we actually put the needs of the Aboriginal and TI and more for Indigenous communities first, and that basically all the research we're doing is driven from not the needs of the researcher, but the needs of the community that we're hoping to help facilitate and improve, more students, Indigenous students involved in allied health, more practitioners and things like that. So we've been very conscious about that right from the start, and Andrea's been, really great in wanting to, delve into that more and see how it is. And look, I'm only just one person. I don't have the knowledge of, there's a lot of people out there have more knowledge than me, more experience in community than me and things like that. But it was important for me as well that, any project that I worked on, that it was about the needs of the Aboriginal and TI communities, not the needs of, the academics who were conducting the research. So I think we've done fairly well. And I do agree with Andrea, it has been harder because of COVID. We would have, had a lot more face-to-face interactions with the people who agreed to interview and participate in the study, but also even working with, the various different Aboriginal community organisations here in Melbourne. We haven't been able to do that. And many years ago, I worked with one of the local Aboriginal community organisations, and just working myself in that environment, it made a huge difference of how to, we were looking at trying to develop a healing model at the time for around issues of family violence and things like that. And it made a huge difference coming from working within the community organisations then to working, for example, with DHSS. So that has been limiting. It is a fact, but unfortunately it's just been something we've had to deal with. But I think we've done reasonably well, I hope.
Oh, well done with what
sorry if please tell me if I'm going on too long.
No. All good.
You'll have to start nodding at us. Is it okay to add something to that, James?
Yeah, go for it, Andrea.
Well, it just related to that was quite a theme that came through in our interviews when we chatted to a host of Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff. And I think for non-Indigenous staff, there was this feeling of, discomfort maybe is a good word, in really wanting to be supportive of Indigenous students, but not knowing quite the best way to do that, and feeling so almost, I guess, culturally unsure that it was a bit of a blocker in acting. I don't know if that makes sense.
Listen, it does, and I think it flows into a couple of questions that have been asked by Robin and Matt as well. And Robin's question was, how do we make spaces more culturally safe for allied health students at university? And Matt's is probably a flow-on from that, which is around how do you go about integrating Indigenous knowledges into allied health curricula, and is that possible, and what are some strategies around that?
Oh, Matt starts with a big one for sure. We might need an hour for that one. Yeah, I have to admit, it's not a lot. We found like a lot of differences in how people went about embedding cultural knowledges. So most allied health courses were quite aware that they needed to include some sort of cultural knowledge within their course, and were in the process of doing that, but they weren't quite sure what that would look like. And is that a 2-hour workshop, or is that something that's, embedded throughout the course? And how a lot of courses were, I suppose, going around that is that they were consulting with external organisations, so specifically Aboriginal organisations with knowledge about this area, and consulting with them on the best way to go about it. And other courses had community of practices, which were quite good. And so they'd come together, course coordinators from various disciplines would come together, with an Indigenous person who was a mentor or leader in that to guide them through that process. So those were some of, I suppose, the best practice models that we came with. We didn't find, and I don't think anyone knows the right answer yet of what the best way to embed it. I suppose perhaps the biggest gap that we found was that everybody was doing something in the curriculum space, as in trying to incorporate Aboriginal lecturers or knowledge in the content. But what was lacking is when Indigenous students went out on placement, that was a bit of a gap because, you know, universities have far less control over that external placement experience. And placement is such a huge part of health study in particular, that was probably the biggest gap that we found, is that most course coordinators were thinking about the curriculum, but then if a student had an uncomfortable experience on placement, then it all sort of fell apart. Kim, I don't know if you had anything to add on that. I did have one additional point. Was people said a lot about, one of my favourite quotes was, when I look out the window, I see a white man's world. And I thought we often think about cultural safety in terms of language and content, but not necessarily visual spaces. And I thought that was a really important point as well. So images and pictures on buildings and, representations, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's true. And a lot of, I've been talking to both students and, sort of academics, both Aboriginal students plus, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal academics. It was interesting. You could see the gaps there, that there were, some, for example, non-Indigenous academics who were very, very conscious of the colonisation of space and things like that. And they were very, clear about not speaking over or for Aboriginal students or Torres Strait Islander students, and trying to open up that space in their courses and things like that. Then there were other academics who, as Andrea said, were sympathetic, but they just didn't know how to do it, or there wasn't. What was a big barrier often was not that they weren't willing to do it or open up and incorporate more Indigenous knowledge and practices and into their courses. Often there was institutional barriers at a higher level that made it very, very difficult for them. So often, there'd be some universities who would give a nod to, yes, inclusion of Indigenous students and knowledge and things like that, but in practice there wasn't really a lot of it going on. So that made it very difficult even for those non-Indigenous or even Indigenous academics who wanted to incorporate more. With the students, the cultural safety was, as Andrea said, was a big issue, and it came up in every single one. And I know even myself, as as an Aboriginal student, it has been an issue for me as well. Through I'm now finalising my PhD, but in the years that I've been at university, it's been something that's very conscious. And obviously having the student unit has always been a big of big importance. But then I can only think of one course that I have did in my that I've tutored in, that was consciously, there wasn't a specific Introduction to Aboriginal Australia course, but was that covered other areas that actually went out of their way, the academic went out of their way to incorporate Indigenous knowledges and things like that. So it's something that often is not thought about. And so for Aboriginal students, I remember one student sort of saying that, it felt like they had nothing. There wasn't role models for them. They felt out of place because of all of the knowledge that was around them didn't incorporate, for example, I think this was in a dietetics course. There was very little information in the dietetics course that related to positivity around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so that was very alienating for them, and it actually resulted in them leaving the course. So there's these sort of things that do happen. I might leave it at that.
Excellent. And I think what I'm hearing are things that are very consistent in the Indigenous higher education space, or that have been well documented in the Indigenous higher education space. I want to bring more of a focus on the allied health component. And I know, Andrea, you mentioned the Indigenous Allied Health Australia a number of times. I know when I was on my own equity fellowship, Donna Murray was visiting University of Saskatchewan the same time I was as well. So clearly looking at what's happening in that space globally, not just here in Australia. But I guess I'm interested in, what does that relationship look like with IAHA for you? And are they using your findings to inform some of their work at all?
Yeah, so the question was initially driven by Alan, who was CEO of IHL before Donna. And he was particularly interested in how do we get pathways into audiology and speech pathology, because the numbers of Indigenous professionals in those fields are particularly low. And also, how can we build pathways from vet potentially into higher education? And so the recommendations I'm particularly interested in is there a way of looking at pathways from vet study into allied health study? So that was their main interest at the time, and that's the bit we'll be feeding back to them. Yeah. Again, COVID came along, and IHA are a small organisation, so they've had to change their focus quickly this year and collect data around that. So I have a feeling, yeah, it'll be interesting to see all the changes to universities due to COVID and all the changes that are going on in health in general, how they all feed in together by the end of this year.
Cool. Hopefully that goes some way to answering Nadine's question. She was specifically asking questions around professional bodies. There's a few people that have also asked around what have been some of the promising practices or good practice that you've heard about within an allied health context in higher education, things that have worked towards improvements, particularly over the last 20 years.
Yep. So some really sort of good examples. Well, all the Indigenous units we spoke to are phenomenal. I mean, the work that the Indigenous support units do are absolutely phenomenal. And I think students rely on them heavily. But they all said that, you know, they need to be broader than just the unit. It also needs to go into the academic side of things as well. So some really great examples that we saw in the sort of the academic coordinator type space was where people would build community of practices across disciplines and discuss that in a Aboriginal-led way and in a really open way. That was great. We saw other examples of an institution which was a dual sector institution, and it had a very strong relationship with an Aboriginal organisation. It offered TAFE level qualifications at Cert 3 and diploma, and then it offered very clear pathways between those onto health study. And so it would sort of lead the students through those. So in this case, it was nursing. So they would discuss with students who were interested in nursing, if they didn't want to go through the degree pathway, they could go through a TAFE pathway and then go on to the nursing pathway. So it was really, the coordinator worked between the vet course and the higher education course. So it was quite well, it was really clear for students. They were led through the various options, and I think that worked really well. And another great practice, which again happened to be nursing, even though that was a bit outside of the scope, they've been working in the space a lot longer, so they've got some really good examples, was where they had a Aboriginal midwife who was a liaison and a mentor for students. So students could approach that person for any questions, concerns, and they acted, you know, like a mentor, counsellor, academic, career, you know, an all-in-one sort of person that they could approach and go to. But we also had examples of people building very strong relationships with non-Indigenous staff members as well. And I wanted to point that as, so people that they trusted, that they felt comfortable with, and that seemed just as important as, you know, having Aboriginal mentors as well.
And did you, and I know that there was one question that was asked around how, or were there any examples of fostering collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students? Were there any specific activities or programmatic work that you know of that was really focused on that sharing and two-way learning between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students?
Oh, that's a great question. No, we didn't specifically ask that. I think pretty much all the Indigenous graduates that we spoke to were the only Aboriginal identifying student in their class. So, and they may or may not have disclosed their Aboriginality to their classmates or to their lecturers. And so I think most of them brought up quickly that they felt they had to adapt and they had to learn a different style of communication because they felt they were the only person. And so then when they went to the Indigenous Support Unit, that's when they relaxed. They felt that was a space they could, relax. So, but no, that's a really good question. I didn't come across any particular exercises that people mentioned that they did. Kim, I don't know if you come across any.
No, I don't recall anybody mentioning anything, or even, one of my jobs early in the project was to basically trawl all of the university websites and look at the pathways and basically find out, what were the baseline pathways that for Aboriginal and TI students into all the various courses across Australia, I think we looked at 46 universities. And so basically, I spent quite a bit of time, several weeks, going through that, looking at the program, having at times to, ring coordinators and find out exactly what was going on. And there was none in there that was specifically talked about at that level of how do you, even students coming in and sharing that knowledge and being together, that there'd be projects that teamed up non-Indigenous students and Indigenous students, and then talking to the students that who participated in the interviews and surveys. None of them had mentioned anything there. So I think what was noticeable, as Andrea said, was that the student units were immensely important for both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, because it gave them a space of feeling they could be themselves, of not having to worry about many of the other things that they were having to worry about in the course. It gave them the support and the people they could talk to and go through. And I know, for example, one of the interviews that I did of a team of the Indigenous student unit staff were one of the units that I had been part of as a student, and also had worked with them as an ITAS tutor. And it was even having that interview myself, doing that interview, how do I put it? It was a really comforting experience for me, just doing that interview, because I knew a couple of the people, they knew who I was, they knew my history, and a lot of the things they brought up and said was something that had been my personal experience as well. So I think it would be good for universities, obviously, to look at it at a more institutional level, not just putting it on individual course conveners and things like that, but how do they broaden this out? One of the things that was noticeable at a couple of universities, sorry to go on, was that they had now finally had designated spots for Indigenous staff working in specific disciplines, which I think made a huge difference. And talking to those staff members, you could see, hear the difference that it made. And one university said that they had, one of the course committees I spoke to said there was a spot like that had been designated for an Indigenous academic and coordinator to work inside the discipline, but it hadn't been filled for something like 3 years, which, is to me very problematic. So, what is it that there's in that institutionalized broader nature at the university that is stopping this? They've got it on paper, but they're not actually following through in practice, which I think is something that really is, has to be thought about, and how does that not just become tokenistic?
And it sounds like that mirrors some of those earlier facts that Andrea presented right at the start or in her presentation around there being such low levels of Indigenous participation in the health workforce as well. And it seems that that is also mirrored within the higher education space of people that need to be teaching about that potentially as well. Kim, I just wanted to go back to something you mentioned right at the beginning just then, was that you did some mapping work initially, and there's been a couple of questions that have been received around vet to higher ed pathways for Indigenous students in the health space. And I know we did some work a few years ago, a NESHI funded project around vet to higher ed pathways, but I'm wondering what that looks like, or whether you heard any stories of people transitioning from vet to higher education, whether that be from community services, Aboriginal primary healthcare, or the like.
Yeah, there was some particularly that had gone through that process, and as Andrea sort of talked about in her presentation, that often the students had, you know, done several diplomas or certifications or things like that, and so often they were in many ways kind of overqualified because they'd done so many different ones before they could eventually move into deciding to move into higher education. One of the things that was noticeable that a number of people had mentioned was that often, as we know with many Indigenous students going into vet, often vet is preference because of often there's more regional campuses, it's more localised, it's also seen as an immediate way to get a qualification and move into the workforce, you know, which in and of itself is an important thing. But for many of them, they said it hadn't even been a consideration to them that they could go on to higher education, that they could move into tertiary and, you know, doing bachelor degrees and things like that in the field that they wanted. And that wasn't presented to them even going into it. So they said it was only often by chance that somebody would bring this up to them, or that it would be something that would be suggested to them. So it was not something that was actually part of any, you know, structure. It was just something that they kind of stumbled across and then thought, oh yes, I want to go and do this. And then when they did that, it was very difficult, often trying to figure out how to navigate that pathway. It could be very stressful and very difficult. And even just like mapping, for example, as I was saying, I was mapping initially the pathways across the universities, and some university websites, as simple as this, some university websites had very, very clear documentation of pathway. You could find it very quickly. Others, it was terrible. You couldn't find the information. It was very hard to, you know, see where it was. Some of them, if it was me, for example, you know, some students might know that there are Indigenous units that exist on campus. Some of them might not know that you can actually apply for different pathways. So often in the worst case scenarios, it wasn't prominent, it wasn't easily accessible just on a website. And if you can't even find it on the website, how are you going to make your transition, whether it be straight from, you know, maybe as a mature age worker or somebody who's worked in, who's done their vet qualifications? It made it very difficult. So I think, you know, even things like that, as simple as that, would make a huge difference. And trying to figure out, you know, the things like bonus points, credits, all of these things could be very difficult for students. So, you know, the students who did it were very happy that they did it, and they were glad that it happened, but it wasn't an easy journey for them. And I think we have to look at how do we make that transition much more easier. And just sorry to add that the other point a number of people made, particularly those who had gone from the vet transition to the higher tertiary education transition, was talking about the starting point in high school, that often there wasn't the information available for Aboriginal and TI students at high school level, that this was possible to go and do these courses and things like that. And they were saying that that was really important and needed to be something that factored in as well.
Thanks very much for that. It was a really comprehensive answer, and, you know, again, seems to be quite consistent with some other research that's out there. Andrea, I might turn to you. We've had a question around the other end of of those transitions, moving out of higher education into employment, and to what degree students are supported in that, Indigenous students are supported in that process, and how important is that?
Yeah, well, I should have said as well, like I didn't get to present much of the quantitative data in the talk because, you know, it was so compressed, but that growth by profession we found was really different depending on the profession. So some professions such as social work were showing really big increases in Indigenous students over the last decade, whilst other professions were just stagnant, and you know, TAFE entry was part of that. And I think similarly, students were attracted to allied health because they were really motivated to make some sort of improvement in their community, but they were also really interested in getting a job, you know, as a lot of students are. And health has been known traditionally as having a relatively good employment outlook. And so a lot of students were attracted to allied health for that reason. And placements and their experience on placement often contribute to that. So the networks that they make on placement and things like that. So even though we didn't look at that employment end, I would have loved to, we were really sort of looking at the entry into, most students did mention that once they graduated, it was often tricky because they felt like pioneers. And so they may not necessarily have found it difficult to get work, but they did find it difficult to represent their identity in work, and perhaps also the burden of being the Indigenous voice. And sometimes they may not necessarily want that. So sometimes it's a bit tiring to be the, you know, Indigenous voice or Indigenous champion that people come to for advice all the time. So I probably didn't have as ideal an answer for that. I would love to do another project on that. But it came up as a theme anyway by our respondents.
Just to quickly add to that, was one of the things that a couple of the graduates mentioned that we interviewed was that exactly what Andrea was saying, that going into the field, often, you know, there was still pressure on them because of being seen as the Indigenous voice, but often there was also a stereotyping of what their role should be within field, and often it was quite limiting, and it was seen as not being you know, as particularly as treated as professionally as they should be, to match their qualifications and the broadness of what they've done, and often, so it was often very narrowing down of, oh, you're Aboriginal, you're TI, and so we'll just get you to deal with, you know, the cultural issues, Indigenous issues, which are important issues, obviously, and are needed. But there was also a very sort of pigeonholing of those professionals as well, which some of them expressed that this was a frustrating thing, because, you know, they obviously came into the field, many of them came into the field, you know, wanting to obviously contribute and give back to the community, be part of the community, build the needs of the community and capacity and things like that. But then there was also, you know, it was almost like a double-edged sword of what was going on. So I thought that was quite an interesting thing there. And still, again, having to, much like their clinical placements, having to deal with that broader sort of often working in a broader field where they might be the only one or two Indigenous professionals there. It made it very difficult. Whereas if they were working in a more, say, an Aboriginal community-based health organisation or things like that, the experience was quite different for them.
I know that there's, thanks very much for that response. I know that there's been a few questions around the methodology that you adopted as part of the fellowship, and in particular the balance between qual and quant, and how many Indigenous students were interviewed as part of the project. Can you just comment on that for us, Andrea and Kim?
Yeah, so we was a mixed method, so we had quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative we did, so looking at departmental data, so, you know, Department of Education, So we looked at their data, so their numbers of Indigenous students across 10 allied health programs, and tried to work out how they differed from their non-Indigenous peers on socio-demographic variables. We also looked at vet data, so through the Never Vet site as well. So looking particularly at Indigenous numbers in TAFE pathways which could potentially lead on to allied health study. So things like Indigenous allied health worker qualifications and things like that. Qualitatively, we offered things like focus groups, interviews, and we also did an open-ended survey, and this was adapted because of COVID, so we had to put everything online. So in the end, we got about 70 respondents who did the survey. We had about 10 Indigenous participants who were students and or graduates, some of them identified as stakeholders and graduates. And, Kim, I might have to ask you, how many did we interview focus groups in the end? I want to say about 15, but was... Oh, Kim's off. But
sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was, do you mean the group focusing, how many in the group focusing? Yeah, probably about that sort of thing. That would be about right. So I think we had about, with the students, it was 12 to 15 from memory that did the face-to-face interviews with us, and then there was the online stuff, and then with the state, we probably had more, slightly more stakeholders, I think, than that. So yeah, does that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So roughly about 100 qualitative all up, and together with the quantitative data, and we also, as Kim did, some web searching, so environmental scanning of what universities were offering in terms of Indigenous entry pathways and things like that.
Excellent.
Just to add on, who did we get to, how did we sort of approach it? Basically, I put together a mailing list, which was hundreds of people. Hundreds of both, to Indigenous units, to academics, stakeholders, and things like that. And that was basically sent out, and the option was given. People could either do the survey, or they could, volunteer to do the face-to-face interview. So yeah, that was it.
Thanks very much for that. I just wanted to also ask one last question, and that was around, I guess we've heard about some of these students being the lone soldier as they go into their profession, or one of very few. And I know that Nadine asked a question around the role and responsibility of professional associations, and Matt's asked questions around the preparation of non-Indigenous people to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients as well in this space. I know that the Australian Psychological Society issued an apology back in 2016. How important are those sort of, I guess, actions in terms of advancing work in this space, whether it be for non-Indigenous and or Indigenous Australians to feel comfortable working in an allied health space?
I think it's a really important issue. So we did, I did an environmental scan of policy documents of professional bodies. So as you mentioned, the Psychology Association put a lot of work into an apology, but they also mentioned Indigenous recruitment as part of their accreditation standards. So for those of you not familiar, for health qualifications, they have to meet accreditation standards that are, decided on by professional bodies. And so those professional bodies have quite a lot of power in what unis will include in their course or shaping courses. So I think by including Indigenous inclusion as a professional body, you can put a little bit of pressure on course coordinators or universities to think more carefully about it. So I really think they have an important role to play. So when we looked at professional bodies, we looked at 10, around 7 of them had been involved in reconciliation action plans together with Reconciliation Australia. So they were at that early stage of developing reconciliation action plans. A couple of professional bodies hadn't done any work on that at all. And a handful of professional bodies, we saw 2 that had included it into their accreditation standards. And if we look at medicine and nursing, they all include it, and they've done a lot more work on that. So I think that really is essential, that professional bodies include more of that in their policies. And as you said, we had a handful of professional bodies who also have either an Indigenous board member or an Indigenous-led advisory group as part of their, as part of their board as well.
Excellent. So it sounds like Indigenous leadership and governance is really important in the way that's approached.
Absolutely.
I know that we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to hand it back to Sarah now, but a huge thank you, Andrea, to yourself and Kim on doing a really important piece of work sitting at that health education nexus in terms of Indigenous students and equity in higher education. Back to you, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, James. And just what an absolutely terrific conversation. Thank you, Kim, for taking the time out and joining us and sharing your insights. And also, of course, Andrea, for your great work in this space. And I think your video, I mean, I learned so much from watching it myself and listening to you. For everyone else, I'm conscious of time, but I do want to remind you that the Fellows reports will be published up on the National Centre website. There is a couple of bulletins up there already, and one of which is from Andrea's. And if anyone hasn't yet engaged with the Centre, I would encourage you to jump on our website to have a look at some of the resources we have up there. We have quite a selection of reports and research and other fellows' work, and I've put a slide up, so anyone who would like to, the minute you hit our website, then you'll be signed up for the newsletter as well. So I just want to thank everyone once again, and please join us tomorrow when we'll be hearing from Dr. Janine Delahunty, who will be exploring and presenting on her research, which is focused on regional, rural and remote students, and it's called On Footprints in the Sand. So rather an intriguing title, so I hope that you'll all be able to join us then. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, thank you. Bye.